In 2011, a single lock of hair changed everything we thought we knew about the human story. It had been sitting in a museum drawer in Copenhagen for nearly 100 years, cut from the head of an Aboriginal man in Western Australia, sometime in the 1920s, and given to an anthropologist who probably thought he was collecting a curiosity. When geneticists at the University of Copenhagen finally sequenced the DNA inside that hair, what they found stopped them cold. This man's ancestors had left Africa between 62,000 and 75,000 years ago, at least 24,000 years before the ancestors of any European or Asian alive today. He was not related to a lost branch of humanity. He was the oldest branch of humanity, and his descendants are still there, still in Australia, still on the same land. For 75,000 years, most people, when they hear about Aboriginal Australians, think of one story: an ancient people, a terrible colonial history, a culture struggling to survive. What very few people understand is that Aboriginal Australians are not just old in the way that all Indigenous peoples are old. They are old in a way that breaks the models scientists use to understand human history entirely. And deep inside the genome of Aboriginal Australians, there are 4 things that science currently cannot explain: a hominin species that left no bones, an internal migration that left no genes, a genetic diversity that should not be possible on a single continent, and a population that, by every rule of human genetics, should not have survived as long as it did, in the way that it did, without being transformed beyond recognition. This is the story of the oldest continuous DNA on Earth, and the institutions that spent 200 years trying to prevent us from reading it. To understand why the numbers inside the Aboriginal genome are so extraordinary, you need to understand what normally happens to human populations over time. When people move, they mix. When they mix, their genetic differences blur. Native Americans and Siberians, separated by the Bering Land Bridge for at least 15,000 years, are still more genetically similar to each other than Aboriginal Australians from southwestern Australia are to Aboriginal Australians from the northeast of the same continent. 2 communities separated by a few thousand miles of outback, on the same landmass, speaking related languages, with documented trade routes between them, are genetically more distant from each other than populations on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. In a 2023 Nature study sequencing 159 Aboriginal Australian genomes, researchers found that communities diverged from each other between 26,000 and 35,000 years ago, and then essentially stopped exchanging genes. For 30 millennia, neighboring populations maintained strict genetic boundaries that the rest of the world's human population simply did not maintain. The study also found that Aboriginal Australians carry the highest proportion of previously undescribed genetic variation seen anywhere on Earth outside of Africa. More novel, uncharacterized DNA than any other population ever studied. But that raises a question that takes us even deeper into the genome. All of this ancient, isolated DNA was not sitting idle. It was working, being tested every single day against one of the most punishing environments any human population has ever inhabited for a sustained period. Because survival for 50 millennia on the driest inhabited continent on Earth required more than just cultural ingenuity. It required a biological revolution. Australia is not simply hot. Large parts of it are a physiological trap. Extreme daytime heat, overnight cold that drops tens of degrees in hours, almost no standing water across vast interior stretches, a fauna whose caloric density and protein-to-fat ratios are completely unlike the prey animals that shaped the metabolisms of populations in Africa, Europe, or Asia. For 50,000 years, the only way to live here was to evolve for it, and the Aboriginal genome shows in precise molecular detail that this is exactly what happened. One of the most studied examples sits in a gene called FADS2. This gene regulates fatty acid desaturase, the enzyme that processes polyunsaturated fats and converts dietary nutrients into the compounds the brain and nervous system require to function. In most of the world's populations, FADS2 variants evolved to process plant-based and grain-based diets, reflecting the agricultural shift that transformed most of humanity around 10,000 years ago. In Aboriginal Australians, researchers identified a completely different set of FADS2 variants, ones optimized for a high-protein, high-animal fat diet with minimal carbohydrates. These variants did not appear recently. The genomic signatures indicate they were being selected for across thousands of generations. The Aboriginal body was being molecularly tuned, generation by generation, to extract maximum nutritional value from kangaroo, emu, reptile, and insects in an environment where a miscalculation could mean death from organ failure, not just hunger. The heat adaptation story is equally striking. The 2016 Cambridge study identified strong selection signals in genes associated with the thyroid system, specifically NIDA1 and KCNJ2, both linked to how the body regulates core temperature and metabolic rate in desert conditions. These are not cultural adaptations. They cannot be learned. They cannot be passed down through oral tradition. They are written into the biology of every cell in the body, the product of a selection pressure so consistent and so long-running that it reshaped fundamental physiological systems at the molecular level. The same study found selection signals in genes linked to serum urate levels, which affect the body's ability to manage dehydration. In practical terms, Aboriginal Australians evolved a measurably different capacity to handle the biochemical stress of water restriction compared to any other population on Earth. This is the paradox that the data forces you to confront. The genetic uniqueness of Aboriginal Australians is not just a record of ancient isolation. It is a record of 50,000 years of active, biological problem-solving, conducted in the most extreme laboratory the Earth has to offer. The genome is not just a timestamp. It is an engineering document. And it was the same biology, adapted across millennia, that the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians brought with them when they first encountered something that science still cannot fully account for. A ghost written not just in DNA, but in the very structure of the genome itself. But here is what the official textbooks won't tell you. The Aboriginal genome does not just contain the oldest modern human DNA on Earth. It contains DNA from a species that has never been physically found. The landmark 2016 study published in Nature, the first comprehensive genomic analysis of 83 Aboriginal Australians conducted in close collaboration with community elders, found something that has quietly unsettled geneticists ever since. Approximately 4% of the Aboriginal Australian genome derives from archaic hominin admixture that was not Neanderthal and not the Denisovans identified from Siberia's Denisova cave. It was something else, a third group, an as yet uncharacterized species of human, relative with whom the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians interbred somewhere in Southeast Asia between 44,000 and 50,000 years ago, on their way to the continent. Professor Eske Willerslev of Cambridge, who led the study, said plainly, "We do not know who these people were. They were a distant relative of Denisovans. They mixed with modern humans, and then they disappeared. The only proof that they ever existed is the 4% of their genome that Aboriginal Australians carry today. No bones, no tools, no burial site, nothing but a ghost, written in living DNA. And the Denisovan story gets stranger still. Aboriginal Australians do carry Denisovan DNA, around 4 to 5%, far more than any Eurasian population. But when scientists compared the Denisovan sequences in Aboriginal genomes to the Denisovan genome from Siberia, they found they were genetically distinct. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians had interbred with a different population of Denisovans, a southern population, one that lives somewhere in Southeast Asia, and whose physical remains have never been found either. Two entirely separate populations of an extinct human relative, both encountered by the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, both genetically traceable, both physically invisible. Then there is the linguistic paradox that geneticists are still trying to explain. 90% of Aboriginal Australians today speak languages from a single language family called Pama-Nyungan. According to linguists, this language family is only about 4,000 years old. But Aboriginal people have been in Australia for 50,000 years. Where were the languages that came before? The 2016 Cambridge study found genetic evidence of an extraordinary internal migration around 4,000 years ago. A group of Aboriginal people who spread from the northeast across nearly the entire continent and changed the way Australia spoke, not by replacing the existing population. The genetics are clear. They did not replace anyone. They left no lasting genetic signature. They changed the language and then, in the genetic record, they simply vanish. Willerslev called it a really weird scenario. A few immigrants appearing in village after village, changing how people speak and think, and then disappearing like ghosts. In human genetics, he said, we have never seen anything like it before. And then there is the witness that cannot speak. Approximately 4,000 years ago, the dingo suddenly appeared in the Australian outback. Not gradually, not through a slow diffusion across the continent. Suddenly, as far as the archaeological record can determine, a domestic dog of clearly Asian origin was present across Australia, the same continent that had been isolated from outside genetic contact for 50,000 years. The same continent where the linguists had just detected an unexplained cultural wave sweeping from the northeast. The same continent where the geneticists had just found an internal migration that left language but no genes. The timing is not a coincidence, it is a problem. In 2013, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences made headlines around the world. Analyzing Y chromosome and autosomal DNA from Aboriginal Australians, the researchers reported a signal of Indian gene flow into Australia dating to approximately 4,000 years ago, arriving at roughly the same time as the dingo and the microlith stone tool tradition. The conclusion seemed clear. People from the Indian subcontinent had reached Australia, mixed with the Aboriginal population, brought their dogs, introduced new stone technology, and sparked the Pama-Nyungan language expansion. Case closed. Except the case was not closed. When researchers returned to the question using full whole genome sequencing, the picture dissolved. The 2016 Cambridge study, with far greater genomic resolution, could not replicate the same Indian signal in its Aboriginal Australian samples. The Y chromosome data and the autosomal data were pointing in different directions, and more recent analyses have consistently struggled to find a clean, unambiguous Indian admixture event of the kind that the 2013 paper described. What the data does show is that something happened around 4,000 years ago in Australia, something that brought the dingo, something that shifted stone tool traditions across the continent, something that may have reshaped how most of a continent spoke, something that, in the genomic record of the people themselves, left almost no trace at all. The animal arrived, the culture changed, the language transformed, and the genome, by most measures, stayed the same. Either a group of people arrived from outside Australia and somehow contributed nothing detectable to the gene pool of the people they encountered, which would be nearly without precedent in the history of population genetics, or the cultural transmission happened through contact so limited, so specific, and so carefully bounded that it bypassed the kind of mixing that leaves genomic signatures. A transaction, not a migration. An exchange, not an integration. The dingo as currency in a negotiation between two worlds, the terms of which left no written record and almost no genetic one. What is certain is this: whatever happened 4,000 years ago, it happened to a population that had already been managing its own boundaries, its own genetic structure, and its own biological evolution for 46,000 years before that event. A population whose genome had been shaped by selection pressures so unique and so sustained that it contains the highest density of novel genetic variants found anywhere outside Africa. A population that had already encountered two separate populations of extinct hominins, interbred with both and preserved both signatures for 50,000 years without either being diluted into noise. The dingo is a mystery, but the people who welcomed it, or traded for it, or received it from whoever brought it, are a deeper one. But here is the part that history has tried hardest to bury. While scientists were making these discoveries about the most genetically significant population on Earth, other scientists and collectors had spent 200 years doing something else with Aboriginal remains entirely. The first recorded Aboriginal skull to reach European shores was shipped in 1793, taken from a young man killed at Botany Bay by British settlers. The skull reached Europe before the continent it came from had been properly mapped. What followed was not science, it was a trade. A skull could fetch a year's wages in the 1800s. A Tasmanian Aboriginal skull was worth even more because collectors believed Aboriginal Tasmanians were, in their words, the most primitive people on Earth. Researchers at the Creative Spirits Documentation Project found evidence that some collectors did not wait for natural deaths. Indigenous people were shot specifically for their skulls. An Adelaide physician in the late 1890s used his hospital position to supply a steady and illicit flow of remains to the University of Edinburgh. Bodies cut from battlefields and massacre sites were beheaded, packaged, and shipped to anatomy departments in London, Edinburgh, Berlin, Stockholm, and Washington as specimens. By the early 20th century, an estimated 10,000 or more Aboriginal remains had been sent to the United Kingdom alone. They are in museum collections, in university anatomy departments, in private storage. As of today, the majority have not been returned. The first recorded repatriation from the UK did not occur until 1990. The Australian government, as of 2025, is still in active negotiations with 35 institutions across 10 countries for the return of further ancestral remains. Think about what this means in terms of the science. The remains that could definitively answer the most important open questions in human evolutionary genetics: the identity of the unknown hominin in the Aboriginal genome, the timeline of the first migrations out of Africa, the mystery of 50,000 years of population structure in a single continent. Those remains were being used as teaching props in anatomy departments, filed in drawers labeled natural history specimens, sold at auction. The irony is almost too precise. The institutions that claimed to be studying human origins were simultaneously destroying the evidence of the most ancient human origins on Earth, which brings us to where things stand now. In 2016, the year of the landmark Cambridge study, Aboriginal community elders sat alongside geneticists as co-authors on the paper that established their ancestors as the world's oldest continuous population outside Africa. That is what ethical genetic research looks like. And that partnership is now producing results that no amount of colonial-era specimen collection ever could. The 2023 Nature study of 4 remote Aboriginal communities, again conducted in close collaboration with community representatives, found the highest proportion of novel, previously undescribed genetic variants ever identified outside Africa. Variants that do not appear in any global reference database. Variants whose function we do not yet understand. Variants that have been conserved for 50,000 years in isolation and may hold information about human adaptation, disease resistance, and survival that the rest of the world's genomes simply do not contain. 75,000 years of unbroken presence in one place, 4% of their genome from a species that has left no other trace on Earth. A biological toolkit refined over 50 millennia for the most extreme environment on the inhabited planet. An internal language transformation with no genetic cause. A dog whose arrival no migration fully explains. The Aboriginal genome is not just the oldest continuous DNA outside Africa, it is the most consequential archive in the history of human science. And for 200 years, the institutions that claim to value that knowledge were grinding it to dust in anatomy classes. The question of what that archive still contains, and what it might still tell us, is one the world is only now beginning to take seriously. If you found this journey into the deep human past compelling, hit subscribe. The stories that science is only beginning to read are the ones most worth knowing. Thanks for watching.